Pierce, Vice President of Sustainability. I'll be kicking us off today. So for the agenda for today's, again, week 1 training on sustainability guidelines. Today's training, we're going to focus around the intent of the guidelines, what our roadmap for sustainability is here at HCR. So for those that have looked at the guidelines in advance of this meeting, you'll notice there was a roadmap there. We'll go over that briefly. How the guidelines should be applied for your HCR deals, what different types of terminology we're introducing in the guidelines as part of the release of them, so the construction types, and we'll go over how the guidelines are structured in terms of how you should navigate the document in your various roles. And then we'll hopefully leave about 15 minutes for questions and some responses. As you may have heard, we are recording this training and it will be posted online. We will not be posting the Q&A section, but we will document a sort of FAQ page for any questions that do come up during that period in the question section. So as Christy mentioned, we're working really hard here at HCR along with other various state agencies to help create what we call a draft scoping plan to help reach towards the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019, shorthand known, and I'm sure some of you have heard, as the CLCPA. The CLCPA sets ambitious targets for New York State that represents all sectors of the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 85% by 2050 and at least 40% by 2040. 2030, apologize. And those are the really core goals that we in the housing sector are very conscious of. You can see here on the slide that there are other goals that the CLCPA mandates the state come up with a plan of how to achieve those goals. So another sort of tangentially important goal here is that all electricity will be 100% zero emissions by 2040. So this is relevant for our grids that we have in New York State, our power plants, that they will actually be utilizing renewable energy. You can see the 70% renewable energy by 2030, as well as a really big goal of increasing our offshore wind production of energy. And some other various goals you can read here, but really to flag and highlight that we have, that 85% greenhouse gas reduction goal by 2050 as part of the mandate of the CLCPA. And so, as most recently in January of 2022, Governor Hochul made a statement that by 2030, 2 million homes need to be climate friendly, which is either electrified or electric ready. And that's to reduce greenhouse gases. And I'll just ask, I think there's a few folks that might not have been on mute. So if you could please mute yourself, that'd be great. Thank you so much. So that 2 million home goal is really important for us here in the Housing Agency of New York State. As part of that 2 million home climate friendly goal by 2030, at least 40% of those homes need to be located in what we call disadvantaged communities, or you can sort of think of as low to moderate income households in certain demographic regions, which is still being defined by New York State currently, but that means that 800,000 of those 2 million homes need to be affordable. So that falls really squarely in the work that we do here at HCR. So please, I implore you all, if you're not as familiar with the CLCPA, to please go to the climate.ny.gov website and read more about what's going on there across all sectors of New York State to reach these goals. So specific to New York State housing, and HCR, as you saw in the guidelines book, if you were able to check it out beforehand, we do have this roadmap that HCR has created in collaboration with our NYSERDA colleagues, so New York State Research Development Authority. And so NYSERDA has really been helping us out along with other state agencies to align. And so this roadmap reflects that work and that goal towards reaching Governor Hochul's 2 million climate-friendly homes goal, as well as our ultimate goal you can see here by 2050 of that 85% greenhouse gas reduction. And what that means in terms of our goals as a design requirement and how we get towards those goals. So as you'll see and hear from both Christy and myself today, we've mapped out some changes that go into effect starting this year for certain projects, and by 2023 for certain other programs and projects, which we'll go into detail on, so that by the time we're in 2023, all of our new construction projects will require all electric high performance design standards. And so we'll map that out quite a bit through our training. But just so you have some insight as to where we're thinking as an agency, again, this map is located in both our existing building and new construction guidelines. So we're hoping that that's helpful as you all plan projects both, for tomorrow and 5 years down the line. So getting into the guidelines books themselves, we're really excited to have updated and created a new sustainability landing page, which you can find at our hcr.ny.gov/sustainability. So if you go to that sort of sustainability landing page, which within the New York Gov site, you can then click on the sustainability guidelines box, which is represented here on the left. That'll be about halfway down the screen on the sustainability page. And then from clicking that link, you'll be able to go and download these 2 books directly. And so we will, of course, through this course, explain the difference between the existing buildings and the new construction book. But first, if this is the first time you're seeing this, of course, we have in fact separated out the booklets because we do feel from a sustainability perspective, there are different targets for new construction and existing buildings. And so we've hopefully clearly mapped out the path that we're expecting folks to follow here. So I will turn it over to Christy at this point to get into our construction types.
Okay, great. Thank you, Samantha. So in order to ease navigation in the sustainability guideline requirements, we've defined 5 basic construction types that are used in both booklets. And these are based on categories that we typically see in projects pursuing funding. The terms are defined in both the new construction and existing buildings booklet that Samantha just noted, and they relate solely to the application of the sustainability guidelines, and they're not meant to define project requirements or scopes outside of the criteria defined in these sustainability guidelines. So the first one you can see here is new construction, obviously the simplest of them all, and it is defined as the ground up construction of a building or buildings. Next slide. So the next type is adaptive reuse rehabilitation, which is defined as the substantial renovation that occurs in a building or a space that undergoes the change of use to residential occupancy as defined by the applicable building code. As you'll see, we'll further delve into these guidelines, and the adaptive reuse project as we delve further into these design guidelines, you'll see that adaptive reuse projects have many of the same requirements as new construction. The next type is substantial rehabilitation, which we defined as the renovation where the majority of the interior walls, finishes, systems, and MEP, which is mechanical, electrical, and plumbing for those of you who are unaware, infrastructure are demolished, and new construction scope of work is constructed within the existing building shell. And these are often referred to as gut rehabs. Next slide. And finally, moderate rehabilitation. So the designation of the 2 types of mod rehabs is something that's new to HCR, but will only be referred to in the context of the scoping requirements for the sustainability guidelines. The intent of creating 2 different levels of moderate rehabilitation was to more closely match the various types of moderate rehab projects that we see coming in for funding. So the first type of moderate rehabilitation, level 1, consists of the renovation where the dwelling unit demising walls, most interior walls, and MEP infrastructure remain, and the new scope of work is built within the demising walls. This type of rehabilitation often includes a replacement of fixtures, finishes, and equipment, and roofing. It may also include window replacements, siding replacements, and additional roofing scopes. Now, the second type of moderate rehabilitation is level 2, which consists of a renovation where a dwelling unit demising walls and most of the interior walls remain. This type of rehabilitation includes many of the scoping items that I just discussed in the level 1 mod rehab, but it also includes the replacement of MEP infrastructure and equipment, either in part or in full. So in general, the differences between level 1 and level 2 is not so much how large the scope is, but what the scope would render, what scopes would render a higher energy savings for the project. And that specifically targets more MEP infrastructure and equipment. Next slide. Okay, moving on to application of the sustainability guidelines. So there are currently 3 paths to financing under the multifamily finance programs that these guidelines would be applicable to. They are the multifamily finance 9% LIHTC RFP, which is also known as the 9% competitive process, the multifamily finance 4% tax exempt bond and subsidy financing under HFA, and the multifamily finance open window SIF standalone financing. Now in the guidelines, I'm sorry, can you go back? Sorry. In these guidelines, you'll find this chart that's shown on the screen right now, and this is meant to help development teams navigate the applicable booklet and criteria. So you see, for instance, under the project types, there are the 5 types of projects that we just discussed in the booklet that's applicable to them, either under new construction sustainability guidelines or existing building sustainability guidelines. When there's a mix of construction types in one project, we provide guidance on that as well. So for instance, a project that is proposing to build a new building and a rehab of a separate existing building, you'll utilize the guidelines that match each building type. For a project that may be a single building with a mix of new construction and existing building rehab, that you would follow an adaptive reuse guideline course. Of course, we understand there's going to be unique situations in projects where categories and applications outlined here don't work. And in those instances, we encourage you to reach out to HCR for guidance. For projects that include commercial or community facility spaces, this is the same as it's been in the past. We just ask that the project incorporate comparable energy efficiency measures as those that are required on residential projects to achieve the similar energy savings. Also, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but as you can see, we're in the process of developing sustainability guidelines for projects that are currently under regulation with HCR. Those guidelines are still in development, but the intent is to provide guidance on proactive sustainability measures for existing projects. Okay. Slide. Now the big question, when are these sustainability guidelines applicable? So for projects planning to apply for the 9% RFP, these guidelines will be applicable to the upcoming anticipated fall 2020-9% LIHTC RFP. For projects planning to apply for financing with HFA through the 4% tax exempt bonded subsidy financing program, we expect that projects planning to close in December of 2022 comply with these guidelines. And we also encourage any projects that can feasibly implement these measures into their design do so as soon as possible. Now I will hand this back to Samantha to dive into the structure of the booklet.
Great, thank you, Christy. And again, if you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I know we're going quickly, but we want to make sure we get through everything and have that time for questions. So both the existing building booklet and the new construction booklet follow a very similar structure. And so you'll see that there are 3 discrete sections in each booklet. There's section 1, which is will reference and ask the team to look at which third-party certification they will want to follow. And in the existing buildings booklet, this is broken down by the construction types that Christy just went through, but follows the same format. In section 2, we'll be covering the requirements for system types. So this section 2 is broken down, and you can navigate by HVAC as being a section a category within section 2, or you can go to the lighting category within section 2, and you'll find guidance on what those systems or equipment types need to comply with within section 2 of both, again, new construction and existing buildings respectively. And then finally, section 3, which is our additional sustainability requirements. This section breaks down sort of the there's resiliency, there's indoor air quality, it's some of the additional sustainability features that we want to ensure are covered in the buildings that HCR is financing. And so these are less energy based in most situations, but are more focused on the health and wellness of a building from a sustainability perspective. Within each section, we follow the same format in terms of each section has what we call a baseline requirement, which means in order to get funding for the project, you need to comply with at least one of the baseline requirements. So for instance, in section 1, where we ask you to choose a third-party certification, you need to choose at least one of the mandatory or baseline requirements in that section. And then you'll notice below that there will be within that same area a stretch criteria. That is optional. We encourage all development teams to reach towards those stretch goals, but you are not required to comply with all of the stretch goals in the booklet. You are also able to reach some stretch goals in some areas and not other stretch goals in other areas, depending on your project or program's specific needs. So if you choose the stretch goal under section 1, you're not obligated to then follow all of the stretch goals throughout the booklet. But again, we do encourage teams to reach towards that. So you'll notice throughout both the new construction and existing building document, we've tried to wayfind through graphics. So your baseline requirements will be noted with some blue text and hopefully be clear in that way. And the same with our stretch goals being in green. So we hope that that is somewhat easy to navigate. So within our new construction booklet, wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of some of the high level direction that we're going in, which is within section 1, which is again our third-party certification section. For new construction, we will be requiring all new construction, again that's ground up, to be all electric, meaning all appliances and heating systems need to be all electric systems, and choose one of the baseline criteria that's listed in the baseline requirements. A lot of these in this area come from what was formerly known as Appendix F within the design guidelines. So there's not a huge change, although we've added some additional certification standards that we think are equivalent. And then you'll see as an example what the stretch goals for the certification would look like. So again, if you are a developer and you are choosing to go with a stretch goal, you do not also need to comply with the baseline in section 1. So you would not need to get 2 different certifications. That's one uniqueness about section 1. In new construction only, if you choose a stretch third-party certification standard in section 1, you can skip section 2. So in other words, your choice of a section 1 third-party certification stretch goal is your fast pass to go from section 1 and then just comply with section 3. Then when you get to section 3, you need to comply with at least the baseline standards in section 3, but have the option then to also comply with or choose the stretch goals within section 3. So again, this is for new construction only, that you have that fast track pass to skip section 2 if you choose a third-party certification stretch goal from section 1. And I will turn it over to Christy to walk us through the structure of existing buildings.
Great, thanks, Samantha. So some of the booklet highlights that I wanted to give for the existing buildings booklets has to do a lot with another wayfinding strategy that we implemented into it. And that was the reason for that is because this booklet contains 4 types of projects: adaptive reuse, substantial rehabilitation, moderate rehabilitation level 1, and moderate rehabilitation level 2. This was in attempts to ease navigation, and we color-coded the text in the various project types in the existing buildings booklet to help with this. So as you navigate through the booklet, you should be able to easily identify the applicable project type and identify the criteria that applies to that specific type. For instance, in the section for thermostats and controls, you would find a section that's applicable for moderate rehabilitations level 1 and 2, and a section that's applicable for adaptive reuse and substantial rehabilitation. And each of those would have different criteria that's applicable to them. So where it's not specifically called out as applicable to a construction type, then that criteria would apply to all projects. You could see in the slide here on the right, sorry, Samantha, I jumped the gun on that. This is just a snip from the booklet. You could see the highlighted text for baseline requirements and stretch goals that Samantha talked about earlier, along with the highlighted text for those 4 different project types. Okay, so this slide is a summary preview of the criteria that's laid out in section 1 of the existing buildings booklet. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, the adaptive reuse requirements in section 1 are nearly identical to the requirements for new construction, in that the projects must be all electric and choose from a third-party program to certify with. And as Samantha mentioned, many of those programs are programs that have been pulled over from our previous requirements that were found in Appendix F of the design guidelines. The stretch goals for adaptive reuse projects still maintain the all-electric requirement, but utilize third-party programs that represent the highest standards for energy efficiency and carbon reduction. And those would be LEED version 4.1, BDNC 0, 2020 Enterprise EGC Plus, and then Passive House. So I realize we have a typo there with Enterprise Green Communities, but apologies for that. Moving on to substantial rehab projects, the baseline standard requires a 20% energy reduction in the project and certification with either 2020 Enterprise Green Communities and LEED V4.1. Stretch goals for this project include the goal of electrification of the building and highly efficient third-party standards that are similar to those found in the adaptive reuse requirements. Moving on to moderate rehabs, both level 1 and 2, both of these will require an IP&A to be conducted. And this is important to note, as in the past, HCR has encouraged IP&As, but they were not mandatory for many programs. IP&As will now be required on all moderate rehab projects, subject to the sustainability guidelines. For level 2, which is the category where the scope includes replacement of MEP infrastructure and equipment, the baseline requirement is that the project meets a 20% energy reduction threshold for the project, and the stretch goals align with those for substantial rehabs. For moderate 1 rehabilitation projects, aside from the IP&A, projects will be required to retro-commission HVAC equipment, insulate all domestic hot water and HVAC pipes and ducts, and comply with the water efficiency and lighting efficiency requirements outlined in Section 2 of the guidelines. Stretch goals for this type of project include a 20% energy reduction for the project, and creating a path to electrification and/or becoming electric ready. Again, we'll get into the details of all these criteria in the upcoming webinars that we have, where we delve deeper into both the new construction sustainability guidelines and the existing building sustainability guidelines. So I believe that's it. I am now going to hand it back to Samantha to lead us into the Q&A discussion and discussion section of this presentation.
Great, and I just wanted to flag before we move on to the next slide that we are, as Christy mentioned, next week's session is going to focus on a much more deep dive into the content of the new constructions book, opposed to holding a 3-hour webinar and doing everything at once. We hope that this approach is appreciated and fits with folks' schedules and allow for different members of your team to join the training session that would be more applicable to their work. So we are excited that we'll be doing that as a separate event. This was really meant to be an overview session, and so happy to, we'll move to questions in just half a second. I wanted to also flag one thing that I realized we didn't mention is typical to our HCR process there are some exemptions for some things. So we'll switch to questions, but we do acknowledge that in the booklet. And so as you are hopefully reviewing it, and part of what we'll get into next week and the week after with existing buildings is highlighting what those exemptions are in the process for making those making HCR aware of what those exemptions for your particular projects might be.